As a Scrum Master, how will you handle changes in requirement, in processes, in stories, in futures, in the middle of a project, in the middle of a sprint? Today, we want to talk about understanding what we mean by change management. Change management is very important. It's a very important concept in Agile, and you will not go through an interview without experiencing any question cutting across change management, which is why it's a very important concept for you to know, not just as if you're answering another question, but for you to know why they're asking this question and for you to understand from a three-dimensional aspect how you can be able to approach this question from a leadership perspective, from a Scrum Master perspective, from a developer perspective. This is what we're going to handle in this video today. I'm going to be talking about different dimensions of change requirement or areas in which changes can affect if you're working from a perspective of a Scrum Master or an Agile coach. Number one, there can be changes in requirement. Number two, there can be changes in the future you're working on. Number three, there can be changes in the story that you're working on. Number four, there can be changes in the scope of the project. Number five, there can be changes in the definition of done. And number six, there can be changes in the definition of ready. Now, it doesn't matter what angle these changes is coming from. The first thing which we're going to cover today is to discuss on why we need to accommodate changes, which is a very big principle in Agile implementation. All right, welcome to the Scrum chat room with Dr. Francis Imbunya. It's kind of been a while I came in here, but definitely putting up some great content for you. And this video is going to be one of those videos you get to learn so much practical stuff in a very simple way that you won't find it elsewhere, right? So our goal is to bring you information in a way that kind of help you understand the in and out of Agile. Okay, so let's go straight and start learning for today. In most of the cases, you're going to have a lot of changes coming in. And most often, although we kind of learn while we're doing our theory, right? And this is why I always say that having a certification doesn't make you a Scrum Master. No, it's about the practical aspect of it, which is what we're going to teach you today. Now, which is why you always say, okay, Scrum will tell us that changes in the middle of a sprint or in the middle of a project is anti-pattern. Avoid that, right? But this is something I can tell you in almost every environment is difficult to avoid, because as human and as a growing economy, requirements are constantly changing. So we need to be able to create an adaptable environment that can work on that. And that is why we plan according to Sprint. Now, if you've been asked, how will you handle changes in requirement in a project, right? This is from a scope where they're assuming that you're a senior Scrum Master or you're working at the level of Agile coach or even a Scrum Master, and there's a whole complete change in requirement. How will you handle that as a Scrum Master? How will you approach how you respond to this question in an interview? All right. Now, I know generically, many of you are going to say, okay, I'm going to talk with my PO, I will talk with my team, we're going to try to understand why the changes and then find out a way to work with it. That is good enough, right? But then let's look at an expert angle from looking at it. What makes you different, or what kind of separates you from someone that knows barely how to do it and someone that master exactly how to do it is the angle from which you approach a question. So very important, not just answering the question rightly, but how you've been able to analyze a question. And why is this very important? It's very important because I have seen people that have worked with me with my community of practice and being on an interview, and the company actually requests them to fly them on site so that they can have a last set of interview with them. Now, the difference is in how they are able to approach. I think couple of months back, I was on an interview and I was answering a question on the coaching technique. And I was talking about the love coaching technique, which is definitely not an agile way of doing stuff, but it's a very powerful coaching technique to get to help people transform. And the interviewer like, oh, can you repeat that? I want to take down some note on that approach. The first time I'm hearing that, right? That's what makes you different. Now, without deviating from the main point we're talking about and keeping us focused, focus is one of those big concepts in agile. In order to respond to the question how to handle changes in requirement, the first thing you want to understand, why are we even changing? So if I ask you, how will you handle changes in requirement? And you go ahead and say, all right, when there's change in requirement, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to sit with my team for us to understand. I sit with my Scrum Master. That is cool, right? That's right. But then think about it this way. If you ask me the question, how will you handle changes in requirement? And I approach it from this angle. Okay, I'm assuming if there is a change in requirement, it means that the customer has actually changed their mind. It means that maybe there were some mistakes that need to be fixed, or there should be something that is causing us to change requirement. So let's assume that is because the stakeholder actually changes the way they want to build a project. All right. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to understand the source of the change and the rationale of that change. When I understand, for instance, if it's a change from a stakeholder, understand that, okay, this is something we need to accommodate. But is a change from an internal team, maybe because they pick a wrong tool, and because of that, we need to do a whole change. That is now a learning opportunity for me. So from the angle from the change, it's obviously going to affect the way I deal with it, the way I document it. So I always pay attention to the source, what is really causing us to change. Now, when I gather this information, from the stakeholders, and now it helped me to better facilitate or coordinate with my team to know exactly what we need to do. At this point, you need now to give your case study or practical example, right? For instance, in one of the team I work with, and we were about to go into PI2, and we actually had a planning. But then a day before we launch our iteration, management reached out to us and said, okay, you know what? We are pulling Future 2.4 completely out of IP iteration 2, and we want you to swap this with this iteration. Right. That was not something we expected because we spent quite a lot of time working on this feature. Now we have something completely new. So, as a team coach, what I did is I had to meet with my ROTE and request why this is coming up now, given that the team has already put in all the effort. And my ROTE has to explain to me why this is happening. So my ROTE actually explained to me the way requirements are being collected from the program level, and a bigger shift that has came in just last night from the customer and requiring management to do some really huge changes. And if we actually continue building this that we have planned, we are not going to be able to deliver the value that the customer wants. Now, understanding that this was a customer demand and this customer is keen, we had to do everything possible to accommodate that. But then I needed now to renegotiate my capacity and velocity. Why? Because my team needed more time now to understand the new features that we are taking in and to also renegotiate dependency with other teams. All right. Now, I did kind of give you a three-dimension point of view. There is no way you're going to answer this question from this perspective and someone tell you you don't understand exactly what you're saying. Right. So in most of the cases, one of the things you can do in order to shorten the length of your interviews and how many questions they ask you is to be able to prepare solid case study. But you can only prepare solid case study when you have practice, right? And this is why I always say this over and over again. Get yourself in a community of practice. I know you've been trying to do it on your own. You've been trying to watch all the videos, but these most of the time do not help you, right? So We actually offer an environment for you to practice and practice as if you're a Scrum Master, and how you can be able to analyze most of these cases, how you can be able to even talk as a leader. Very important. Now, I also make this joke that many of you, the only day you get on video is the day that you want to take an interview, and the video doesn't even recognize your face, right? So being yourself in an environment there, you start learning what you're going to do in a job. That is what draws you closer to the job. So we've handled changes in requirement. Now, the second thing we want to do here is what happened. That was a change in requirement in terms of a whole future changing that we need to pull one out and one in. Now, let's talk about changes in requirement of a story. That is also a change that can happen at the learn of a team, right? Let's say we're working on a story and we want to build a sensor into this pen in such a way that any person who take out this pen out of this building, we can indicate that, oh, there's a sensor on the pen. Now, while we are working on building an integrated sensor within the chip, now we change the requirement and say, you know what? We don't want to build a sensor any longer in it, but we want to build a tracker. Now, there's a change in requirement. We're building something in. First, we're building a sensor, but now we want to build a tracker. Now, the requirement that we need in order to build it to come as a tracker, the level of story, is different from the requirement we need to build a story. Is different from the definition of done and all of that. So in that case, when a story change, how do you handle that? Now, the way you handle a story that changed as a Scrum Master is that you first of all need now to ensure that the team understand the new requirement. They go back and revisit the definition of ready for that new story and the definition of done. Have that conversation with the team. And if they understand it, then we can go ahead to prioritize that. Is it something very important for us to move on with? And then if it's a yes, then we can go ahead. Now, with a story, what you want to pay attention, if you're doing a change requirement at the level of story, you pay attention to the new requirement meeting the definition of ready and the definition of done, which I'm going to talk about that in a bit as well. Now, another requirement that may change in a product or in a project is scope requirement. You will often talk about scope creep, right? And how to handle that. That's another requirement that might change in relation to a project, the scope. The scope simply means that we are reducing probably the output, or we are increasing the output, which means that we are needing now more resources than we have, or we need to reduce resources. So whenever you hear a question concerning changes in scope, what exactly we're talking about is about resources, right? And changing the scope, question will come in like, in the middle of the sprint, there's a lot, your manager bring in more work. That's now change in scope, right? Or you're working in the middle of the sprint and they pull out most of the story and your team now doesn't have enough story, right? That's change in scope. So change in scope affect your resources, right? Affect your capacity. Okay, and that is why we always say that when you plan, factor in what? Factor in a buffer. Now, the first thing when you receive more requirement, the first evaluation you do is about, can this requirement be accommodated by the buffer that we put aside that? If this requirement can be accommodated by the buffer, then we can negotiate on how we rank it or how we prioritize it based on how urgent it is. Okay, if it's urgent, there's some project that are like your manager can say, okay, I want you guys to drop everything and work on the new requirement, right? When that is a management coming from above, and definitely you need to understand why that is urgent, and if that rationale is on point, you have to drop everything else. Why? The person who plays the direct contact with the customer, it's management. It's not the customer. It's not the Scrum Master. It's not the PO. The PO only communicates to the internal customer, which is the manager. The manager, the reason they call product manager is because they are the one managing the value that is being delivered in that product. And if you find yourself in an agile release train in a safe setting, you realize that those who actually prioritize how work come into the team is a combination of the system engineer, the product manager, and the ROTEs, right? So they have the decision making over what should be built and what not should be built. And don't only ever think that you are the only person at the team level doing work. No, backlog prioritization is also going up at the program level, right? Your managers are also doing backlog prioritization and they're arranging how work comes in. So in most of the cases, don't always look at what coming into your team as an anti-pattern. No, there are different levels of planning. So when it comes in, your main opportunity is to understand why this change at this particular point and how you can be able to accommodate the change. If yes, no, if not, no. Now let's look at the fifth dimension of change in the definition of done. All right. Let's say that a story was to say, build in a tracker in a pen and we're done. And now at the end of the day, it's kind of add in more other step. We want you not just to build this and you're done. We want 5 different level of testing to occur before we ever get it out. Now that's the change in the entire definition of done. A change that occur in the definition of done, the way that you notice that, or the way that you'll be able to figure out that this change is in the definition of done, is going to affect the process through which you go through. Remember, the definition of done is not only tied to the acceptance criteria. Most often, you can read the definition of done of any team by looking at how their Jira board is structured. What are the different levels a story need or a task need to go through before we can validate it, move it to the ready for acceptance? That define the definition of done. So something affecting the definition of done will affect the process through which a story need to go through. In some organization, it goes through in progress, it goes through in QA, it goes through ready for acceptance and done. In some, in progress, in review, in QA, in user UAT, user acceptance testing, and in done, right? So it just depends which of the company you work with, but this can actually vary across different company. But the definition of done, if there's change there, it affect the entire team, it affect the processes, affect the way we validate work. Now, changes in the definition of ready, what we're talking about here is what do we know to make sure the story is ready? Now, a change can be for a story to be ready, the tech lead must validate that and mark that as ready, right? So in that case, you can actually, as a Scrum Master, input some processes or implement some steps that ensure that we ensure that we are implementing this definition already. Let's say that usually you normally used to have pull up your story to a backlog ready for dev, and then you have in progress, and then you have all the other processes that follow. Now, if we have a changes in the way of definition of ready, and which means that let's say the tech lead need to validate every process. Now, when you actually build or when your team actually get a plan, do your backlog prioritization and get things in, now you might need to have what? A pre-demo to the tech lead for them to validate prior to you moving into the new sprint. So that might be like a change in the definition of ready. All right, there's so much that we've learned in this video. And if this actually makes sense to you, make sure you put a thumbnail and make sure you share. And if you're someone struggling with interviews, hit us up, check the description. You are going to find information where we can help you close this journey, right? Be in a team where you are sure that you're going to make it no matter what happens. Okay, I'll see you in our next video, and you have a great weekend.